Message
Number 5.
91.
Senators, I move that, in relation to Bill C-91, an act respecting Indigenous languages, the Senate A, agree to the amendment made by the House of Commons to its Amendment 11B, and B, do not insist on its amendments to which the House of Commons disagrees, and that a message be sent to the House of Commons to acquaint that House accordingly.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator Harder, seconded by the Honourable Senator East Belmar, that in relation to Bill C-91, an act respecting Indigenous languages, may I dispense? Yes. On debate, Senator Harder.
Honourable Senators, I rise to speak to the message from the other place regarding Bill C-91, an act respecting Indigenous languages. On behalf of the government, I want to thank Senator Sinclair for his sponsoring of this bill. Thank you as well to other members of the Senate Aboriginal Peoples Committee for your important work on this important legislation. C-91 proposes flexibility as to how communities and groups may use funding for their own language priorities. In fact, the preamble of C-91 speaks to Canada's recognition that, quote, a flexible approach that takes into account the unique circumstances and needs of Indigenous groups, communities, and peoples is required in light of the diversity of identities, cultures, and histories of Indigenous peoples. With respect to the message from the other place, the government has accepted a total of 5 amendments made by the Senate, while respectfully declining 11 amendments and modifying 1 in the French version. Of note, an amendment moved by Senator Patterson would clarify that legislation could include arrangements made with Indigenous governments, organizations, or provincial or territorial governments in areas such as the provision of programs and services in Indigenous languages in the areas of, quote, education, health, and the administration of justice. The government agrees with this amendment and is open to discussing cooperative arrangements to support the use of Indigenous languages in areas of provincial and territorial jurisdiction with willing partners. I would also like to highlight an amendment proposed by Senator Sinclair that the government hasn't accepted. That amendment would provide access to federal services where capacity and demand exists in Indigenous languages. The government believes that this is a significant shift in the way that government could provide programs and services, and it looks forward to co-developing regulations and agreements that define, among other things, important concepts such as capacity and demand. Overall, the government has chosen to respectfully decline Senate amendments that would reinforce stronger funding commitments within the legislative framework. While fully respecting the spirit of the amendments, the government believes that after having consulted with a number of Indigenous governments, the previous wording in Bill C-91 places a duty on the government to provide funding without infringing on the authorities of Parliament. The government has also respectfully declined Senate amendments that would remove references to provinces and territories in certain sections of the bill. The government's view is that this is not the intent of the legislation and that the constitutional framework fully reinforces the protection of rights and jurisdictions of Indigenous governing bodies and also to the division of powers between provinces and territories. Further, it is the government's intention that the legislation should foster cooperative dialogue on supporting Indigenous language while fully respecting all affected jurisdictions. The government has also chosen to respectfully decline Senate amendments that sought to alter the definition section of the bill. The government believes that the provisions as drafted are sufficiently broad to include appropriate organizations, and that to cite specific types of organizations may lead to confusion about whether the definition is intended to apply to others. The government intends to work with Indigenous peoples and to work with any organizations that have an interest in this matter. Bill C-91 is an important piece of legislation with immense potential to reverse the dramatic loss of Indigenous languages over the preceding decades. It reaffirms the government's commitment to reconciliation while ensuring our Indigenous languages are strengthened and appreciated. Each and every Indigenous language in Canada will be able to benefit from this legislation once it has been enshrined into law. I thank all honourable senators for their work on this matter, including our colleague, Senator Joyal, who has championed this issue through his Senate public bills over many years. This is an example of the private and tenacious work of an individual senator helping to build a case, drive debate, and ultimately lay the ground for a major policy change in Canadian society. On that note, and in closing, I would like to briefly quote from Senator Sinclair's remarks earlier in this Parliament on the debate of Senator Joyel's Bill S-212. Senator Sinclair's remarks capture the philosophical importance of language as an expression of culture, identity, and worldview. This is an important point as we think about Bill C-91, and also as we think about official languages in Canada, the importance of celebrating and maintaining many mother tongues in our diverse and inclusive society. So from Senator Sinclair, I quote, "Who are you?" It's not a rhetorical question. It's a question which asks you to contemplate the fundamental question of your identity and character. To be able to answer that question, you need to know where you and your ancestors came from, what you stood for, your personal and collective history, what your influences have been, what your ambitions have been and are, and what your purpose in life is. Language and culture are keys to personal identity. Personal identity is key to a sense of self-worth, and spiritual and mental wellness hinge on one's sense of self-worth." End quote. Honourable Senators, for those of us who take the integrity and continued existence of our first language, whatever it is, for granted, we should walk in the shoes of fellow Canadians who do not have that security. We should feel free and feel and understand the deep anxiety that would accompany a threat to one's conceptual and ancestral worldview as expressed in language. Therefore, Honourable Senators, it is important that Bill C-91, with C-91, we take this important step to remedy historical injustice and act together to walk the path of reconciliation. I urge you to support this motion.
Senator Sinclair.
Apparently my speech has already been delivered by Senator Harder, but thank you very much.
Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, Senator Harder didn't deliver my speech. So I am pleased to rise today as critic for the bill to speak to the message received on C-91, an act respecting Indigenous languages. When I spoke to this bill at third reading, I spoke of my gratitude to members of the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples for working collegially to unanimously pass amendments that I believe not only greatly improved the bill, but proved to witnesses who came before us or submitted briefs that the Senate was listening. Our amendments address key concerns raised at committee and communicated to this chamber and the other place in our report on C-91 at the conclusion of our pre-study. The committee opened that report by explaining that, quote, "The vitality of Indigenous languages varies across the country, but no Indigenous language is safe. The committee recognizes that, given their critical state, work to revitalize, protect, and promote Indigenous languages is an urgent task necessary to ensure that Indigenous youth for years to come can learn their own Indigenous languages." Further, Algonquin Elder Claudette Commanda, the Executive Director of the First Nations Confederacy of Cultural Education Centres, suggested that revitalizing Indigenous languages could have a positive impact on the health of First Nations communities and the self-esteem of First Nations youth, end quote. I firmly believe that every member of our committee understood the weight and importance of the work we were doing on this historic bill. Our report went on to identify key areas in which we could improve the bill. One of those areas was funding. The report states, quote, "In the absence of clarity around funding, witnesses identified characteristics they believe are essential to ensure funding contributes to language revitalization. Funding must be permanent, long-term, and reflect the diversity of Indigenous peoples and languages, including those living off reserve and in urban centres. As emphasized by the Native Women's Association of Canada, funding must be consistent with Jordan's principle to ensure that there are no jurisdictional disputes, as Jordan's principle ensures Indigenous children receive essential public services regardless of where they live. Indigenous languages must be considered an essential service. Further, witnesses felt the funding should be distributed to Indigenous peoples undertaking language revitalization work, as opposed to national political organizations, end quote. In an effort to address this persisting vagueness surrounding the promise of, quote, adequate and sustainable funding, end quote, in the bill, the committee unanimously, and I feel it's important to continually stress the word unanimously, agreed to adopt guiding principles to ensure that funding was fairly allotted in line with the stated purpose of this bill. Those principles included: A, the number of persons composing the Indigenous language population of an area; B, the particular characteristics of that population; and C, the objective of the reclamation, revitalization, maintenance, or strengthening of all the Indigenous languages of Canada in an equitable manner. We thought very carefully and took great care in developing this amendment, honourable colleagues. It is regrettable that the government did not agree with the Senate's objective of bringing increased clarity to this important issue. Equally regrettable, and this is especially for me to say as Senator for Nunavut, is the government's choice not to give credence to the legitimate concerns of Inuit. The committee's report clearly points to the fact that, quote, despite their involvement in the co-development process, Inuit were particularly concerned that the bill was not distinctions-based, did not reflect Inuit priorities, and did not take into account the unique status of Inuktitut as a language spoken by many Inuit in their homelands, end quote. An annex was presented to the committee by Inuit leaders and supported by witnesses such as Inuit Tapiri Kanatami President Natan Obed, Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated President Aluki Kotiuk, and Nunavut Minister of Education, Minister of Culture and Heritage, Minister responsible for Arctic College, and Minister of Languages, the Honourable David Joannesy. The annex presented thoughtful ways of addressing legitimate concerns of Inuit regarding the preservation, protection, and promotion of Inuktitut. It was my pleasure and my great honor to present amendments that responded to the concerns surrounding the provision of services in an Indigenous language alongside Senator McPhedran, who introduced an amendment that would recognize the unique status of Inuktitut within Inuit Nunangat in the preamble. Thank you for that, Senator McPhedran. Additionally, Senator Coyle called for a review of service delivery within Nunavut, following the testimony from Nunavut Language Commissioner Helen Klingenberg, who gave evidence that, quote, the Government of Canada has to comply with our Inuit Language Protection Act, end quote. She further pointed out that the Government of Canada signed a declaration during the creation of Nunavut that promised Inuit the ability to conduct government business in Inuktitut. Although all these amendments were passed by the entire committee, only my amendment on the ability of the minister to coordinate with provinces and territories on providing Indigenous language programs and services in relation to, but I should add not limited to, education, health, and the administration of justice was accepted. It is particularly discouraging to hear that the government rejected these amendments in light of our report very clearly affirming that the committee believes that Bill C-91 must better meet Inuit needs and priorities. Otherwise, the title of Bill C-91 is misleading and should be changed. Colleagues, C-91 is among several pieces of key legislation that deserved further study and improvement. However, their introduction late into the legislative session has left us where we are today. We are left with a bill that does not adequately respond to the concerns of one of Canada's more widely spoken languages. This bill fails to ensure Inuit leaders that it will meet the objective of maintaining and strengthening Inuktitut. As the Senator of Nunavut, I want to insist on these amendments, and I believe it is our duty as parliamentarians from regions put in this chamber to represent the voices of the regions, to insist. However, I know that there is no appetite hours before the other place rises, and I know that to insist now would be to jeopardize the passage of this bill. And I'm mindful of the positive and giant leap forward this bill will have for the protection of certain Indigenous languages in Canada. And the Inuit do not want to stand in the way of the First Nations and Métis. They made that very clear from the beginning. Therefore, with much reluctance and fully aware of the disappointment that Inuit leaders will surely feel, and they have been pressing me to insist their case right to the end, I will not be moving that the Senate insist on its amendments. Oh, my honourable colleagues, this has been an intense and tortuous journey. I would, though, end by stating my hope that the Aboriginal Peoples Committee will, and I look to our respected chair, Senator Dick, my hope that the Aboriginal Peoples Committee will, in fact, stay true to the promise it made at the end of its report on this bill. And I quote, "Should the bill pass both houses of Parliament and receive royal assent, your committee will continue to monitor its implementation and progress to ensure that the concerns raised by witnesses are addressed." And I want to also close by commending my friend and longtime colleague in public affairs, Senator Joyal, who did great things when he was Secretary of State, and who I think inspired the government to get moving on this issue by the bill that he tabled in this place, even though we knew that it could not have the power of a money bill from the other place. So, honourable colleagues, thank you. Kuyanamik, Kuana Tama.
Senator Patterson, would you accept a question?
Yes, thank you.
Senator, thank you very much, Senator. Thank you very much, Senator. I am a full proponent of this bill, and I'm a full proponent of First Nations learning and studying and writing and creating in their own languages. I always have been. But it's a very daunting task, and I'm wondering just the feasibility of it. Where are we going to find the teachers and the people who can do it? I mean, it's just a question that comes up every time I think of this. I had a young Mi'kmaq friend of mine here last week. He came into the chamber, and he works for Walrus Magazine. I mentored this young man when he was a student at St. Thomas, and now he has a job working for one of the better magazines in the country, Walrus Magazine, but he doesn't speak his own language. And he's 28 years old, and he said that his mother spoke Mi'kmaq some, but not fully. And I'm just wondering how I would ask any of the members of the Aboriginal Committee if if they could answer this. It just seems it's going to be so daunting, and how do we go about it?
Well, I respect that question coming from one of Canada's great writers. Honourable colleagues, the committee was torn in looking at this bill. On the one hand, we heard many voices saying we've got to take a first step. This is a first step we cannot, as a country, not take. But on the other hand, saying that it was a very tentative first step. You know, the Indigenous Languages Commissioner has been allocated some $337 million, I believe it is, in the last budget, and $115 million ongoing. The task is way bigger than that. So the dilemma was, do we reject this rather tentative, a weak first step, or do we try to change it? We tried to change it. We tried to strengthen the bill. We tried to improve the principles around funding, recognizing the size of the task, as you've outlined, Senator Richards. And so we ended up with a disappointing compromise of agreeing to support taking the next step, as we will do today, in accepting this message, watering down our amendments. That's what happened. Our amendments were watered down. But I would say that the attention we've given to this bill and the attention that the Senate has given to the importance of the issue with our work should call on us all to be vigilant as we go forward with our work. And that's one advantage of the Senate, is God willing, we'll all be here after the coming election, go forward with determination and vigor to monitor the progress in this work and continue to push Canada to do its duty to respect the most fundamental right of Aboriginal people, their right to language. And that is the one good thing I said about this bill in speaking to it earlier. It does expressly acknowledge that Aboriginal rights...
Your time is up. Thank you. Senator Dick, would you like to debate?
I'd just like to say a few words. I was inspired by the question that Senator Adams asked, and in our committee report, as Senator Patterson said, as the critic of the bill, on this, in most studies that our committee has done, have always been done in a very collegial and respectful manner in almost all cases. And certainly in this case, that was true. And one of the things that we talked about at the committee and is in the report is specifically with regard to your question, and that is, who's going to do the teaching? And as we know, oftentimes the teachers are those that are certified. And we then said that we urge the government to accept fluent speakers. And so there are a few fluent speakers who are able to pass that language on, but they're not necessarily have a degree, a Bachelor of Education or whatever. And so the fluent speakers and the elders are the ones that are going to carry the language forward. And I know that in Saskatoon, for example, we have the, I think it's called the Saskatchewan Institute of Cultural Center or something like that, where they have recordings of elders speaking in their language. So there are resources available in these community-based organizations. The committee heard a lot about how it was necessary to utilize elders, resources that are available in the communities, and not just strictly rely upon universities and academically trained teachers. I would say that I think it's good that the government accepted a number of our amendments. Without having them all in front of me, I can't really make a detailed analysis, but I think the bill is good. from what we heard, people were very excited about having this bill, even without the amendments, because as Senator Patterson said, it is acknowledging the right to be taught in your own language, which is a big step forward. And I think it is a small maybe step, but it's certainly a significant step. And I would not say that the amendments are watered down. I would say that it's a good bill. It's a good place to build. And I would just conclude by saying our committee has always been good at following up. We followed up with Bill S3. We're following up with Bill C-45. And we need to continue that in the future. And I'm sure that the members of this committee will continue to follow what's happening with this language bill. And I know that the people in the community are going to be writing us, as they do now, to say, you know, what's happening here, and asking us to intervene, asking us to make sure, and to continue to prod, to continue to improve this bill and maybe initiate further actions with the next government. Thank you.
Here. Une question ou un débat?
Question or debate? On debate, Senator Joyal. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Honourable Senators.
I would even venture to say it's a historical day. When I was a kid, my mother was pregnant of my younger brother, and she was always singing. And one day I asked her, why are you singing all the time? And she said, I speak to your brother, your future brother. And it stayed in my mind that the first language you hear will determine your life. And I thought it was so much important when I realized that on my street there were kids who were speaking English only, and I wanted to play with them because I was the only boy on the street, French Canadian. So I thought by learning the language, I would be able to connect and get out of my isolation as a kid. And I went to school with the idea that when you have the opportunity to learn different languages, you discover another world. And as a French Canadian, you will understand. Now, I will speak to you in English because I want that you realize what it is when you were born in one language and when you learn another one, how much you are open to others. And as I learned history of French Canadians, Champlain, who came to Canada and was welcomed the Algonquin and the Huron, he learned their language. He had to, because he wanted to connect. He wanted to settle. He wanted to build a house. He wanted to stay. And he did stay. He died in Quebec City, 30 years later. And he became rooted in the country. Why? Because he was able to connect with the Aboriginal people. And I learned that when I was a kid. And I learned also that through the years, when the new settlers didn't need any more the support of the Aboriginal people, with who they had fought to push back the American in 775, with who they fought in 1812 to push back again the American. And when they expand and became a big, thriving society and become more numerous than the Aboriginal people, well, then that they could impose their language on the Aboriginal people and push them to forget their language, to forget who they were, to forget their root, to forget the first song they heard from their mother. and I was dressing as an Indian. I found back in my papers, because I'm trying to wind up as some other colleagues here in this chamber, and I found back photos of me dressed up as an Indian, you know, when I was 6, 7 years old. And then I was a fan of Rin Tin Tin and Lone Ranger and Zorro and Roy Rogers. And among us, we had to decide who was the Indian, who was the cowboy. And I always ventured to be the Indian, because I like to go naked, you know, breast naked.
Too much information. Too much information.
and put some makeup and whatnot. To dress like the other, to become the other. But I could not become the other, because I was trying to listen to the TV and try to learn some words, you know, to be like the last of Mohican, you know, how he was speaking. I was trying to imitate him, which, of course, when I tell you that, it sounds a bit ridiculous. But I realized that if one day I would have the opportunity to do something specific to make sure that those others would reappropriate their identity instead of me trying to appropriate their identity, I thought it would be the right thing to do. So when I chair, and I had the privilege to chair the patriation of the Constitution, with the help of Senator Patterson and other Inuit people, we had the opportunity to put something in the Constitution to recognize that. But you will understand that 40 years ago, this was like, you know, speaking in the air. I mean, nobody would understand what we would be trying to do one day. And we put Section 22 in the Constitution. And I read it. Nothing in the sections dealing with French and English abrogates or derogates from any legal or customary right or privilege acquired or enjoyed either before or after the coming into force of this charter with respect to any language that is not English or French. And I tell you, honorable senators, that was the about Aboriginal language I had in my head when we put this there. And when I became Secretary of State years later, I met with Senator Patterson. And I offered him, and I offered to Clem Chartier, who was the chief of the Métis people, let's sit together and do something to start supporting and helping the Aboriginal people to define for themselves who they are, even though, as Senator Richard has said, it's such a long way to go. You know, we are on the path of reconciliation to try to rebuild 150 years of assimilation, directly or indirectly. It won't happen overnight. We can't do that overnight. It's impossible. You know, just you as an individual to try to change your own personal habit. Look how difficult it is, you know. So when we, as a country, try to revert the course of assimilation, it cannot happen overnight. We will all try to help us individually to do something, but we sat together and we found a way to do it. And I'm happy to see, senators, that you introduced the amendment that allowed the government to sign agreements with the various nations and with Nunavut government to give way to the aspiration of the Inuit people in relation to the capacity to come back and be proud to speak their language. And that's why in this chamber, honorable senators, in 2006, I, with other senators, Senator Charlie Watt and Senator Adams, we did initiate the experience of allowing Inuit to speak their language on this floor. And I thought, even though we would do it only a couple of times, it was the principle of it. Exactly. Yes, it is possible to do it when there is a will. And you all know politics. When there is a will, there is a go. So, honorable senators, this is such a historical day. I don't think I would like to thank Senator Harder and you, Senator Sinclair and Senator Dick, because what we're doing today will have everlasting impact in the future of this country. We will never be the same. So thank you.
Are senators ready for the question? It was moved by the Honourable Senator Harder. I'm sorry? Oh, pardon, sénatrice Dupuis. Vous avez une question pour le sénateur?
Senator Dupuis, you have a question for Senator Joyal? On debate. On debate. Senator Dupuis. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind us that First Nations throughout Canada, but more specifically in Quebec, who speak French as a second language, and where English has been for many years the administrative language of the federal government. And those same First Nations didn't have the right to teach their children in their native language, whether Atikamekw, Innu, or another language. And yet, despite the adversity that these First Nations faced for decades, they nonetheless persisted in speaking their own language. And they continued to strive to teach their children in their own language. Despite a lack of resources, despite the lack of recognition, they nonetheless managed to create curricula with the effect that though those languages are still threatened, they are still very vibrant in these communities. I would just like to conclude by quoting a Chamikuro individual from the Peruvian Amazon. Around 2000, this person was interviewed because this was a threatened indigenous language. Only the elders spoke it. She was one of the very few individuals to still speak the language, and she said something that really struck me. Chamikuro is their first language, and the second language is Spanish. And she said, there are some concepts that one cannot express in Spanish when one is Chamikuro. That's very instructive. Thank you. Are senators ready for the question? Moved by the Honourable Senator Harder, seconded by the Honourable Senator Bellemare, that relative to Bill C-91, an act respecting Indigenous languages. May I dispense? Is it your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion?
Numéro 6, message